Hello. For today's lesson, we'll be looking at the internal hardware components of the computer. Last week, we talked about hardware, and we said hardware are the physical components of the computer, or they are parts of the computer that can be seen and can be touched. We said hardware can either be internal or external components. So we said the internal ones are the ones that are seen in the system unit, and the external ones are the ones that are being attached to the system unit. We said the external ones are also known as peripheral devices. For today's lesson, we'll be looking at only internal hardware components, the components that are seen inside the system unit. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and describe some internal hardware components of a computer. Let's start. We'll first start with what an internal hardware component is. When we talk of an internal hardware component, we are referring to the physical or the tangible components of the computer that are seen inside the system unit case of the computer. We said the system unit is one of the basic components of the computer, and all the internal components are found in the system unit. So all the components within the system unit are what we refer to as internal hardware components. Now let's have some examples of internal hardware components, or the components that can be seen inside the system unit. So the first one is the motherboard. We have motherboard. The motherboard is the main circuit board inside the system unit that contains other hardware components such as the CPU, the heatsink, the CMOS battery, and so on. The motherboard is the main device inside the system unit that connects other hardware components. Almost all the components inside the system unit are being connected to the motherboard. It has many slots on it where other components are connected to. Now let's have a look at how the motherboard looks like. So this is how the motherboard looks like. When you look at the back, we have many ports where other peripheral or external components are connected to. When you look on it, we have many slots. This helps to connect other hardware components to it. We have many slots over here. We have the PCI slots, the IDE slot, the memory slot, the CPU socket. We have the SATA connectors, and so on. We have the battery too over here. That's the laptop or the computer battery. So the motherboard has many slots that helps to connect all the internal components to it. Now let's look at the next hardware component that is seen inside the system unit. We have the hard disk or the hard disk drive. The hard disk or the hard disk drive is the main storage medium inside the system unit on which information is saved. The system files, that's the operating system files or the Windows files, are being saved on the hard disk drive. Whatever you do on the computer and save as a file is being kept on the hard disk drive. So the hard disk is the main storage medium on which all the information we see or save on our computers are being kept. All the information that we have on our computers are being saved on the hard disk. Now the next device that we'll be looking at, let's have a look at the picture of the hard disk. So this is how the hard disk looks like. We have the big one for desktop and the smaller one for laptop computers. So this is the hard disk, and its main work is to store information, either the system files or the user files. So the main work of the hard disk is to store or keep information on the computer. The next device is the CPU. The full meaning of CPU is Central Processing Unit. The CPU is a device used in performing all the arithmetic and logical operations of the computer. The CPU is the main device used in processing data in the computer system unit. The CPU is known to be the brain of the computer. So the CPU is the device that helps in processing data into information. When we type in data into the computer, or whenever we start typing on our keyboard, the data that goes into the computer are what we refer to as data. And this data cannot be read by human beings. So with the help of the CPU, it works on those data and converts it into information, which is mostly displayed on the monitor screen. So whatever we feed into the computer is being processed by the CPU and comes out as information. So at times, some people refer to the CPU as the main brain or the brain of the computer. Now, this is how the CPU looks like. We have a picture of how the CPU looks like. We have different types. We have this one to be Intel. We have AMD and so on. And some also have pins on top of them instead of the terminals that we see over here. So we have different types of CPU. And the main work is to process to process data into information. That's the work of the CPU. Now let's look at the next device. We have the RAM. The RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory. Random Access Memory. And this is known to be the memory inside the computer or the computer's memory. The work of this device is to store information temporarily, and this information are what is being worked on by the CPU. So in the process of the CPU working to process data into information, some of this information is being stored on the RAM. Whenever you turn off the computer, all the information saved on the RAM is being erased. The RAM needs power to store information. So whenever you turn off the computer, all the information is being erased. When the computer is turned on again, it starts to store or keep data again. Now let's look at how the RAM looks like. This is a picture of the computer RAM or the memory. This is what we call RAM or memory. It's being fixed on the motherboard. On the motherboard, we have a slot known as the memory slot. The memory slot is where we fix the RAM or the computer memory. Now let's move on to the next internal hardware component. We have the ROM. The ROM is not the same as the RAM. The RAM stores data temporarily and the ROM stores data permanently. The full meaning of ROM is read-only memory. Read-only memory. And this is a device found on the motherboard. It is used to store the startup instructions of the computer. And as I said earlier on, the RAM stores data permanently. And the RAM is also a chip which is part of the BIOS chip. Now let's look at how the RAM looks like. This is how the RAM looks like. It's a chip that is being fixed on the motherboard, and it helps in the startup process of the computer. So this is how the ROM looks like. It looks similar to that of a chip, and it's being found on the motherboard. Now let's go to the next device. We have the floppy disk drive. Floppy disk drive. The floppy disk drive is a storage device or drive that reads data and writes information onto a floppy disk. A floppy disk is a storage medium inserted into a floppy disk drive. So the floppy disk drive is just a place where we insert floppy disks. So whenever you insert a floppy disk into a floppy disk drive, it's able to read and write information onto the disk. Now let's look at how the floppy disk drive and the floppy disk looks like. So we have this one to be the floppy disk drive, and this is seen inside the system unit. And we have this one to be the floppy disk. This is not seen inside the system unit, but it's rather inserted into the floppy disk drive to either read or write information onto this one. That's the floppy disk. So we insert the floppy disk into the floppy disk drive to read and write information. The next device is the power supply unit, PSU. A power supply unit is a component found inside the system unit. This component supplies power to the system unit or other components in the system unit, such as the hard disk, the DVD or CD drive. So the power supply, or the PSU, is the main device in the system unit that supplies electricity or power to the motherboard and other hardware components inside the motherboard. Now this is how the power supply looks like. It's having many connectors at 8 ends to supply power to other internal hardware components. Now at the back we have the power port where we insert the power cable. Now the next device is the CD drive or the DVD drive. DVD stands for digital versatile disc, and CD stands for compact disc. These are components in the system unit used to read and write data onto an optical disc. So this is the main device where we normally insert CDs or DVDs into to either watch movies or write information onto them. Now let's have a look at how the DVD or the CD drive looks like. So we have this one to be the DVD or CD drive. And as you can see, we have a disc inside it. So this is the main device that is used to receive discs, to either to read from them or write information onto the disc. The next device, we have the heat sink and the fan. Heat sink and fan. The heat sink and the fan is seen on top of the CPU. The heat sink conducts heat from the CPU and the fan cools it down. So these two devices are seen on top of the CPU. The function of these devices is that the heat sink is being placed on the CPU. So whenever the CPU gets heated, it conducts some of the heat from the CPU, and the fan on top of the heat sink tries to cool it down. Now let's have a look at how the heat sink and the CPU looks like. So we have the picture over here. This is how the heat sink and the fan looks like. We have the fan on top, then we have the heat sink below. The heat sink is a metal made of aluminium, then we have the fan made of plastic on top. So when the heat sink conducts heat from the CPU, then the fan will cool it down. Now the next device is the IDE and SATA controller cables. IDE and SATA controller cables. IDE stands for Integrated Drive Electronics, and SATA stands for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment. These are cables used to connect hard disks, DVD drive, and floppy disk drive to the motherboard. To the IDE and SATA controller cables are cables found in the system unit that are used to connect components such as the hard disk, the DVD or the CD drive, the floppy disk drive to the motherboard. Now this is how the IDE and the SATA controller cables look like. So we have this one to be the IDE, then we have this one to be the SATA. It's having an IDE hose on it. So the name referred to as an IDE controller cable. Then we have the SATA connector at the end of this one. So this cable is also known as a SATA controller cable. Now the next one is a CMOS battery. The computer also has battery. CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. This also referred to as the computer memory and is found on the motherboard. This device controls the date and time on the computer. So the CMOS battery is the main device that controls the date and time. That's mostly seen at the notification area on our taskbar on the desktop screen. Now let's have a look at how the CMOS battery looks like. So this is how the battery looks like. It's a metal, and as we have it over here, we can see that it's being fixed on the motherboard. So the function of this device is to control the date and time on the computer. Now we end our lesson here, but before you leave, you have to do your exercise and submit on your website. The first question is, what are internal hardware components? So you define internal hardware components. Then 2, list the 5 basic hardware components of the computer. List 5 basic hardware components of the computer. I gave this one to you last week. So you list 5 basic hardware components of the computer. Then 3, you draw the power supply unit. You draw the power supply unit. We'll end our lesson here. For next week, we'll be looking at software. Our next topic will be on software. So with any computing book, go through and read more under software so that the next lesson will be easier for you. We'll end here. Stay safe and bye-bye.